He succeeded at almost everything he did. He was known as a very hard worker, a very smart man, and he made himself into the American dream.
I think Hoover deserves credit for setting up the structure, a lot of the structure for radio.
He doesn't go to high school. So when he graduates from grammar school, which might be roughly the equivalent of about an 8th grade education.
Well, I think you can't overestimate the role that amateur wireless operators played, because they really invented not so much the technology, although they helped to push that forward, but the content of radio, what people did on radio, what they thought they could do.
The era of industrialization and innovation was underway, a gilded age marked by great technical advances. Prior to the 20th century, a handful of scientists and engineers had begun to unravel the secrets of electricity. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb and built entire generating plants in New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, while Serbian-American Nikola Tesla and the Westinghouse Corporation established their own electrical empires. Joseph Henry and Samuel Morse perfected the telegraph and Morse code. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi conducted early experiments with wireless transmission across the expanse of his family's estate. By the 1900s, wireless telephony, or radio, was sparking the interest of enthusiasts around the world. The popularity of this new medium spread rapidly. Radio transmitters and receivers sprouted up all over America as the new form of communication attracted both senders and listeners. Growth was so rapid that there was a cacophony of competing voices, and electronic chaos ensued in the absence of laws to supervise and regulate the uncontrolled use of the radio waves by both amateurs and commercial interests.
The hedging system, long followed in the train grade, was opposed today by representatives of farmers'
Post Office Department today to question of airmail service was born. Mr. Dow is protesting against the plans of the department to raise the Chicago Omaha.
This is the story of how Herbert Hoover, Iowa's only president, would bring order out of chaos and help build the foundation of the fledgling American broadcast industry that continues today. Herbert Clark Hoover was born in West Branch, Iowa on August 10, 1874, to parents Jesse Hoover and Huldah Minthorn Hoover, Quakers whose religion would instill in Hoover an appreciation for hard work, education, and mold his personality into one of quiet contemplation and resolute commitment to success. His childhood changed dramatically and early. He was only 6 years old when his father died. His mother passed away 2 years later. Although orphaned at age 9, along with his older brother Theodore and younger sister Mary, Hoover wrote in his memoirs of the fondness he had of his childhood in Iowa.
I am glad, as son of Iowa, to come back to the place where I was born. Here I spent the first 10 years of my boyhood, and I might express my appreciation of those kindly and sympathetic folks who, taking a boy to their hearts, wiped away the one grief of childhood.
A year after his parents died, Hoover traveled to Oregon to live with an uncle, Henry John Minthorn, who had lost his own son.
Well, I think one of the big changes that you see is Quakers don't actually encourage a lot of reading and things, but his uncle was a school superintendent and a physician, and he gets to now have access to, he is very excited, Charles Dickens. He becomes very interested in higher education and improving himself.
Although Hoover never finished high school, he continued to study. His devotion paid off, and he was admitted to Stanford in the new university's first class of students in 1891.
At Stanford, he graduated with sort of a mining engineering degree, and he goes to work for a British company, Baywick Mooring, and London at the time is sort of the center of mining around the world. He's very adept at the financial end of things. He's also has a reputation of understanding if the new technology, a lot of mines, once they feel like they're tapped out, they're no longer considered viable. But he seems to have a very strong knack of understanding if the technology is going to make that mine viable again.
Herbert Hoover embarks on his engineering career in 1895 that eventually would take him around the world and earn international acclaim. 1 year after Hoover graduated from Stanford, inventor Guglielmo Marconi arrived in England after he failed to interest the Italian government in his radio experiments. English investors and the royal family, however, saw the potential of wireless telephony. Marconi consolidated his preeminence in advancing radio as a viable invention and successfully spanned the Atlantic Ocean from Canada to England with the first wireless transmission in 1901. Interest grew quickly, and soon amateurs in America were tinkering with their own rudimentary radio apparatus. The commercial potential was apparent, and radio soon was going to sea. The U.S. Congress passed the Wireless Ship Act of 1910 that required all ships with more than 60 passengers traveling more than 200 miles from shore to have wireless radio equipment. But soon a catastrophe would show the need for more rigorous regulation. The largest ship afloat at the time, the Titanic, foundered in the North Atlantic on April 15, 1912, plunging 1,500 passengers and crew to their deaths after the ship collided with an iceberg. The waves from this disaster touched Capitol Hill, forcing Congress to pass new legislation. The 1912 Radio Act mandated the existence and 24-hour operation of wireless telephony aboard ships. The law also gave the Department of Commerce jurisdiction over radio.
When World War I breaks out, there are a number of Americans who are in Europe who are wanting to get home. And so both Hoover and his wife, Lou Henry Hoover, do extensive work to try to facilitate Americans getting back to the United States. And then they realize that there's a need for food in Belgium and occupied France. Here's where he really shows a strength, because in order to facilitate getting food through a British naval blockade to German-occupied Belgium and France, he has to negotiate with the Germans and the British to make sure both sides are satisfied with the procedures that they're going to be used to ensure that the food goes to civilians rather than, say, the German military.
Warren G. Harding is elected president in 1920, and he offered Hoover the job of Secretary of Commerce. Hoover entered office as domestic radio operations were spreading rapidly and sales of radio sets were booming.
American amateurs started doing things on the air that we still do today. They started playing records and sharing music with people. They started telling jokes, and they started delivering news, and having discussions on things. So really by the time that radio stations came along in the early 20s, American amateurs in particular had invented most of the forms and uses that we think of with radio today.
Broadcasting really came into existence in about 1920 to 1924, when there were like no stations in 1920 and nearly 600 by 1924. The number of stations really grew in the early 1920s, and a large part of this was because of what the industry and government did together. And many of the companies like AT&T, General Electric, RCA, Westinghouse worked with government officials to bring about that transformation.
The growth of radio was fast and unregulated. There were few rules about the number of radio stations, what frequencies they should use, or how much transmitting power. Something had to be done, and Hoover decided to act.
By 1923, Hoover knew that more regulation was probably going to be needed. And he worked with one congressional representative, Wallace Wright, and then some of his staff worked with AT&T in particular, and RCA, but primarily AT&T, to set the agenda for what became the second radio conference. And it's in this radio conference that we really see the business interests of the major corporations take over.
Hoover understood that radio was going to be an important new form of communication, and he wanted radio to reach the American public.
In his desire for the best radio signals to get out to the American public, he decided that his staff should talk with AT&T in particular, because AT&T at this time was experimenting with wireless radio and with broadcasting, much like RCA, General Electric, and other corporations were doing. And it was really the wild, wild west, if you will, at this time, because everybody was experimenting and everybody thought they had the rights to do broadcasting.
Colleges and universities built some of the early radio operations as professors and students experimented with this new medium. Elsewhere, amateurs and commercial interest recognized its potential. America loved radio. As policymakers debated, businesses were selling receivers and the public was buying them. Newspapers carried stories about radio. Magazines specializing in amateur radio emerged, and the public was tuning in and turning on.
There was a letter in the archives from a woman who lived on a farm outside Madison, Wisconsin, in an area that was much more isolated then than it is today. And she described the effect that radio had had on her life. She would go for weeks sometimes not seeing another person besides her husband on the farm. They were, several miles from neighbors. The snow was deep. The post couldn't even always get through. They got a radio for their house. Suddenly she was connected with the world. She could turn it on and hear what was going on in Wisconsin, in places nearby. She could hear the national news. She could get entertainment. She could get hear people talk about household issues of the kind that she was involved with. It was as though a world had opened up. She was not isolated anymore. I think those of us who've gone through the digital revolution can kind of understand the shift between not having access to all the information in the world every minute in your hand, the way that perhaps people born post-revolution cannot.
As American consumers guaranteed the popularity of radio, the number of amateur operators and commercial broadcasters grew quickly. Early practitioners experimented with all types of content: talk, music, plays. It was all new, unregulated, and exciting.
It's interesting because at first, commercial broadcasters and amateurs weren't entirely distinct. A lot of the early amateurs, had commercial operations of some time that they wanted to talk about on over radio, and a lot of the early radio was pushed by radio manufacturing firms. At first, both of those groups were united to some degree in not wanting the government to take over broadcasting. Like the Navy was proposed as maybe the entity that should control broadcasting.
One consensus emerged early: radio should not be government-owned. It should remain in the hands of private individuals. But Washington did have an important role. There was an obvious need to regulate the industry, as operators were going on the air anytime they wished and transmitting on whatever frequency they chose. Adding to this uncertainty was the debate over programming content and the purpose of radio. Should the medium be one of education and enlightenment? Was it a new form of entertainment? Could radio make money? The arguments of amateurs were ignored. They gradually were relegated to the sideline of the debate, and larger commercial interests prevailed.
Well, I think one reason that they prevailed is that there was pretty general agreement in the U.S. that we didn't want to have a license-based system where the government would essentially be in control of broadcasting. And so the people most likely to be able to step into the void there and actually run broadcasting as a maturing institution were commercial broadcasters who had the funds and they had the purposes, because they began to see how radio could be an extension of their businesses. Just like this happened when we began to adapt to web-based communication in the 90s.
Regulation frequently trails innovation. Americans were drawn to the new invention, and the number of radio stations grew quickly. But the competing electronic voices created confusion and interference, as radio operators frequently broadcast on the same frequency. Herbert Hoover, as a businessman, had developed a strong sense of efficiency.
Herbert Hoover, when he was born and raised, was born into the industrializing America. We were transitioning from being an agricultural-based economy into an industrial economy, and we were learning about science and technology, and we were starting to wring the inefficiencies out of the market, and Hoover was an excellent businessman and capable of doing all this stuff.
As Secretary of Commerce, he was determined to spark the nation's potential.
I believe partly because of his business background and his ideas, his experience with international business, and he saw that as, he's also a person who likes to be in charge of things, so he was, it was said of him sometimes that he was Secretary of Commerce and Undersecretary of everything else. And he's very interested specifically in elimination of waste and standardization.
Standardization was at the forefront of Hoover's thinking as he pondered the radio industry, how to bring order out of its rapid, unregulated expansion. His humanitarian experience during World War I required negotiation and cooperation with key forces. Hoover understood that similar persuasion and cooperation would be necessary to clear the static of America's radio airwaves.
Well, in the 1920s, it was very unclear what would become of radio. One thing that began to emerge there was that both government officials and commercial interests began to feel that popular culture in many ways was discouraged. And in most of those cases, it was the kind of irresponsible amateurs that were doing controversial things like, playing jazz, that terrible jazz music, that all of them could agree should not have free reign of the airwaves. It was felt that radio should be a medium of uplift, of cultural unification. It should have speakers speaking in proper English, showing people, and this was a very diverse nation back in the 1920s. We just had waves of immigration from all over the world, that people should be able to learn through radio how to speak English properly, what the norms of American life were, and that certain standards should be observed.
Hoover organized 4 radio conferences between 1922 and 1924. These gatherings included amateur radio enthusiasts, business interests, as well as educational and religious institutions. Hoover wagered that the government and the private sector working together could solve the problems facing radio and forge a model for the industry's future development. He hoped that fostering cooperation among competing voices would pave the way for effective legislation.
So this is a great area where Herbert Hoover was one of the last of his time. He was in an era where the Constitution was interpreted as meaning the federal government was there to grow the economy, to encourage the economy, and we had just added in this new expectation that it was also there to protect consumers. But it wasn't there to guarantee anything. It was there to put in a set of rules, and then people would play within those rules, and that's where businesses were born. The vibrant market economy took hold, and Hoover really believed that the federal government was there to make the rules and then stand back and let the game be played. And he really expected that businesses would solve most of the problems in America.
In his opening remarks to the first radio conference, Hoover noted the interest of Americans in the new medium and the remarkable growth of the industry. The potential of radio to inform, educate, and entertain the public was profound. But he cautioned that the possibility for radio should not fall victim to the temptation of commercial greed. As Hoover worked closely with Maine Representative Wallace Wright in Congress, he also visited with industry stakeholders outside Washington. He met frequently in New York City with Owen Young, the influential head of RCA and General Electric.
Owen Young and Herbert Hoover had a lot in common. Both were orphans, both were self-made men, and both had a love of this country. And both wanted to be able to use the medium of radio to reach out, to the American public and to help, America grow.
Of paramount concern to Hoover and others shaping the future of radio was the question of ethics and freedom of expression. Was radio a medium for everyone, or could station operators limit access to the airwaves? Politicians saw radio as an ideal vehicle for spreading their views and requested airtime to promote their ideas and campaigns. But many station owners feared potentially offensive ideas, and many operators erected barriers.
Who was going to have access to radio? Who was going to be allowed to speak on radio? And at the same time that, with censorship, there was the public's right to receive information. What kind of diversity of opinion are we going to have? And then there was also speakers' rights of access that tied into that diversity of opinion. There was a great deal of fear at the time that the wrong kind of people were going to get access to radio. The radio owners did not want, quote-unquote, Bolsheviks, communists on the air, socialists on the air, because as one operator put it, what will happen to me and my business if they take over?
Delegates to the 4 radio conferences strongly endorsed Hoover's right as Commerce Secretary to regulate radio, to assign frequencies, and to determine operating power. Both Representative Wallace Wright and Secretary Hoover agreed on a minimalist regulatory approach to radio control by the Commerce Department. A more expansive government role in radio regulation, they feared, would fail on Capitol Hill. And, in fact, this first limited proposal to regulate radio was rejected by Congress. Nevertheless, the outcome of the initial radio conference cemented Hoover's power to regulate broadcast frequencies, times, and power. Hoover's control over radio, however, was short-lived.
By 1926, radio had changed tremendously. There were several court decisions that influenced the power that Herbert Hoover had over the control of radio. One decision said that he had to give a radio license to anyone who requested it. Okay, and that was the Intercity decision in 1923. In 1926, the Zenith decision came about because radio stations decided that were we able to get a license, but that he could not tell us which frequency we could broadcast on. Hoover naturally challenged that. The station pushed back and challenged it in the courts and won. This really pushed the issue because Congress knew that broadcasting was the wave of the future and that regulation was definitely needed.
Now, business leaders and trade associations worked closely with Congress to pass the Radio Act of 1927.
Are we going to have an independent commission to decide these radio policies, or are we going to leave this in the hands of the Secretary of Commerce? And it was felt at the time by certain individuals that giving that kind of power to one individual was concentrating too much power in the hands of one person. And so ultimately it was decided that the commission was the better way to go.
Passage of the Radio Act of 1927 effectively closed the chapter of Herbert Hoover's role in guiding the debate about the future of radio in America and clearing the static on the nation's airwaves. But his relationship with radio did not end. it would become a useful tool as he now turned his attention to the upcoming presidential campaign of 1928.
In 1928, America was on a high. We had, 10 years earlier, we had fought the Great War in Europe. We had ascended into, for the first time in our history, a premier position around the globe. The world looked to us as leaders. And after the war, we had changed and put in very conservative politics. We had cut taxes heavily. We had trimmed down government. We had two very popular presidents in Harding and then Coolidge. And when Calvin Coolidge, in his characteristically quiet manner, declined to run for another term, the Republican Party needed another heir apparent. And Herbert Hoover was the perfect candidate. He was a self-made millionaire, self-educated, he was worldly, had been around the globe, he had rescued Europe during World War I, he had international fame, he checked all the boxes off.
Hoover was not a gifted orator. He was not a charismatic politician. He was a successful engineer who loved numbers and relied on statistics and data to promote his policies. Nevertheless, he realized the power of the spoken word.
From the war we have two paramount obligations. We owe to those who suffered and yet lived an obligation of national assistance, each according to his need. We owe it to the dead that we redeem our promise that their sacrifice would help bring peace to the world. The nation will discharge its obligations. The men who fought know the real meaning and the dreadfulness of war.
Hoover recognized early on the value of radio. He was following in the footsteps of two presidents who had kind of revolutionized the president's relationship to the media. President Harding had been a newspaper owner himself, so was one of the first presidents to welcome journalists into the White House. And Calvin Coolidge continued this, and he added in press conferences and invited the journalists into the White House on a regular basis and would explain to them what he was doing as president. Herbert Hoover saw this, and he realized that this gave the press the ability to take the president's message and massage it a little before giving it to the people. And Hoover saw radio as a way to get around the press, kind of. A modern-day parallel might be President Trump and Twitter. It is a way to get a message unfiltered right to the people. And for President Hoover, this was important because he had plans on how to streamline American government and make things work for the people again. And he wanted to be able to communicate right to the people.
The issues Herbert Hoover and radio stakeholders faced a century ago about access, content, and censorship continue today in the debate over the Internet and contemporary communication platforms. Just as radio owners tried to limit access and control content, today's Internet service providers raise the same arguments. Just as individuals and groups sought to spread their ideas through radio, today's content providers such as Google, Facebook, and Netflix seek equal opportunities to distribute their services. As proponents of free speech worried about censorship on radio, today's consumers, media, and lawmakers struggle with hate speech and disinformation. The Radio Act of 1927 was the answer to the challenges facing the pioneers of the radio era of the 1920s. It cleared the static of technological chaos and philosophical conflict. Today's technology is different, but the issues remain: how to assure that contemporary communication guarantees freedom and access for competing voices and interests.